I was kind of like a one-man force, like Charlton Heston in Omega Man. Did you see it? It's beauty.
Well, trust me, that is what we're here to talk about. But first, it's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, everybody. I am Geoff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. And as you heard there in the little opening from the classic early 80s comedy Strange Brew, we are talking about The Omega Man this week. This is 1971. It's directed by Boris Sagal, who was a Ukrainian filmmaker. He did a ton of TV. He worked on things like the Alfred Hitchcock Presents show. He worked on Twilight Zone. He did Peter Gunn, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Night Gallery, Columbo. He did a ton of stuff. He's probably best known, though, for making The Omega Man, although he also did a mini-series called The Dreammakers with James Franciscus. And that's always funny whenever somebody has worked with both Charlton Heston and James Franciscus because of their connection through the Planet of the Apes movies. But I digress here. He died in a very peculiar way, did Boris Sagal. While he was working on the miniseries called World War III, which was, I believe, an early 80s NBC miniseries, he was arriving someplace in a helicopter, and he got partially decapitated by the tail rotor, which is especially peculiar because most of the time you think about if there's anything that ever could happen where a decapitation could happen that comes from the top rotor, not usually the tail rotor. He died about 5 hours later in the hospital after they really couldn't do much for him. When you're partially decapitated, it's very difficult to come back from it. But what they discovered was that Seagal probably was mistaken in the direction that he was supposed to go when he exited the side of the helicopter that he exited on. That's really, really important to understand when you get out of a helicopter which direction you're supposed to go, because that tail rotor is not going to be an easy thing to see when it's spinning. And he just kind of walked right into it. Very peculiar, kind of morbid that I brought that up, but this is kind of a morbid movie, so I felt like it kind of fit. This movie's best known for its star, which is Charlton Heston. Now, Charlton Heston is a larger-than-life movie star in every sense of the word, but he was not particularly known for being a hulking kind of Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sly Stallone type of action hero. His bravado usually came in his presence, in his attitude, in his voice, his incredibly deep voice, his incredibly almost maniacal belly laugh. He did that in Planet of the Apes. He does it again in this movie where he has this moment where he just kind of guffaws at something, and it's always shocking, but it's almost like, yeah, I kind of expect Charlton Heston to do that in the movie. But Charlton Heston, which is funny because his birth name is actually John Carter. It would have been great if he could have been John Carter from Mars, but I digress again. But Heston's best known for those larger-than-life roles like in Ben-Hur or The Ten Commandments. He was just a kind of a man's man, and I'm not saying that in kind of a derogatory or in any other kind of way. I mean, he just brought that kind of machismo and that kind of presence to something. When you first see him in this movie, even though you know he's a medical doctor and a scientist, he still shows up at the beginning of this movie wearing a safari outfit or something that you would expect somebody to wear on safari, and carrying a machine gun. And you look at that and you think, yep, that's Charlton Heston, all right. When Charlton Heston passed away, there was one thing that Roger Ebert kind of quipped, and that was that he is going to be in 3 movies that almost any fan of movies or any cinephile or any student of film will eventually see in their lifetime. The Ten Commandments, Ben-Hur, and Planet of the Apes. 3 movies that 2 of those movies seem to kind of go well together. The third is kind of peculiar, but it makes sense because these are all very staples of not just genre, but of the way movies used to be made and how much bigger than life the 2 of the productions are, and how bigger than life Heston was to make the third one even that much more important in film. With the Ten Commandments, the epicness of that, Ben-Hur, again, another epic, but a huge Oscar winner. But then with Planet of the Apes, that was one of those movies that, along with 2001, really kind of shaped decades of ways that you can tell a science fiction story. And with Planet of the Apes, it did more than just be a movie about a guy who's being hunted by apes who have taken over the world. It's more about, it does have a lot to say about society, about heresy, and so on and so forth. And it's kind of repeated here in The Omega Man. This is based on a really popular Richard Matheson novel called I Am Legend. It was written in 1954. The first time that it was adapted was in 1964 as The Last Man on Earth, starring Vincent Price. Then again in 1971 with this movie, The Omega Man. And then in 2007 with Will Smith, called I Am Legend. Each one of the movies, I think, does a really good job of looking at the central themes of the story that Matheson wrote. The interesting thing is that the novel wasn't, at least back when it was new, wasn't very well received. It was thought of as very kind of plodding, very slow, very, it had nested within it some really good ideas, but really kind of came across as this almost boring tale that was expected to be a little bit more action-packed. It's about a post-apocalyptic situation in which an apparent pandemic has either killed most of the population or turned them into literal vampires who cannot be out during the day, who feed on blood. This movie takes that concept and it kind of spins it a little bit. It's whereas the other 2 movies really do kind of lay into a little bit more of the horror, the pandemic side of it. This movie takes those central themes and does something slightly different. And with that, let's talk about the movie. So this movie takes place in the end of summer 1977 or so, about 2.5 years after a conflict between the Soviets and the Chinese leads to germ warfare. And it is talked a lot about in the flashbacks that this movie uses in the first act or so, about how, germ warfare is something that humans have always been terrified of. And sure enough, that's true. It is something that we are very, very scared of because of the toll it could take. When we tried to stay away from nuclear war, but yet still do something that would swiftly bring about a victory or the end of a war, the concern was germ warfare. And certainly during the time that this movie came out, during the Vietnam War and the use of napalm and the use of this kind of scorched earth sort of idea that kind of was what people think of when they think of napalm, just burning down these jungles and burning everything in it, friend or foe at times. It was something that people were concerned about, was what if this was not fire or a destructive bomb, but was germ warfare? Well, the germ warfare essentially led into a pandemic that quickly spread across the globe. And older people would more likely succumb to it by way of choking to death and then basically dying on the spot. The middle-aged people would be mutated by it by becoming albinos. Their eyes would go kind of silvery white. They couldn't stand the light. They could be out in the sunlight. They couldn't look at light, but they could see it at night. And they also became deranged. And this ends up creating this group in this, the villainous group called the Family, who is led by a former newscaster named Matthias, who is played by Anthony Zerbe, who is fantastic in this movie, by the way. He basically leads them on this crusade to wipe out everything that once was. The old technological world that was is now going to be basically cleansed by fire and purged as being obsolete. They see that the technology of the world, they see that as the fault of what ended up happening and the germ warfare. So they're going to purge it and start anew with their own civilization. On the other side of it is Robert Neville, who's Charlton Heston, who basically, before he died of the plague, he injected himself with an experimental vaccine, and he is immune to the plague that either kills people or turns them into mutants. His job, as he sees it, is to essentially eliminate the mutants, because, as he also finds out later, there is no future for the mutants either. They can't reproduce. They can only take the people. Once there are no more people who will turn into a mutant, it's over for them. It's just a matter of them dying out at that point. They're running out of food and they're running out of time. And he is kind of stuck in the past. He's stuck kind of living life as he would have wanted to live it if everything was normal, and yet things aren't normal. And he kind of has a little bit of psychosis too over being the last man on Earth and being the last person who kind of stands as the old guard. He eventually, at first he believes that he is hallucinating it, but he meets a woman by the name of Lisa, who is played by Rosalind Cash, and he discovers that she is a part of a group of survivors who are mostly children and younger people who, when you're younger, you kind of have a little bit of an immunity. You have the plague, but you don't die from it and you don't transition until you're a little bit older. So he discovers that she is kind of camped out with these children. With them is a medical student by the name of Dutch. Dutch knows everything that Neville worked on before civilization collapsed. So the idea is that, Neville thought he was alone, but he realizes that younger people can basically hold off the disease. People who are a little bit older, like Dutch and Lisa, they have the disease, they have the plague. It's uncertain when they will either drop dead from it or turn into one of the mutants. Well, Lisa has a brother by the name of Richie, and Richie is what basically brings Neville back from the brink of being just this total nihilistic person. He is transitioning into one of the mutants, and Neville decides that he will use his blood to try to synthesize a serum that will essentially cure Richie, and something that could be given to the rest of the other survivors so that they can eventually fight off becoming a mutant or dying from this plague. Well, he discovers that everything works. However, Neville's a little bit more idealistic. He wants Neville to go to Matthias and ask Matthias to basically cure what Matthias calls the family, which is the cult of the people who follow him. And Neville doesn't really want to do this, which kind of puts Neville into this category of people who are too broken, who are too set in their ways, who are a little bit too old for the new world. Matthias and Neville kind of represent the opposite ends of a spectrum. Once people become adults, they become almost like they don't want to listen to any other perspective. They're too set in their ways. So Richie decides to take this upon himself, and he goes to Matthias and says basically, hey, I've been cured of this. Neville has this way of helping everybody. Matthias, partially not wanting to be helped, but also not believing that Neville would help him, decides that this kid's probably just a spy from Neville to give away our nest, the location of our nest, and basically exterminate us. So they kill Richie. And in the final few minutes of this movie, it turns out that Lisa turns very quickly and turns against Neville as well. Neville, trying to save her and escape with her, ends up being mortally wounded by Matthias, who then, as he dies the next morning, he is able to hand off the serum to Dutch and the remaining survivors so that they can go off and restart society. So it's one of those things that Neville being a little bit too set in his ways, combined with, of course, Matthias being totally insane, and Richie being a little too idealistic about the reality of the situation, leads to essentially, at least for now, Matthias winning in the end, which is a little bit of a bummer, but there's hope on the horizon with the serum and the survivors that are going to go off into the mountains or someplace remote and basically restart society. So let's get to the three things that I like about the Omega Man. So first and foremost, this movie does a really good job in the first really in the first half of this movie, setting up the idea of the loneliness and the desolation that Neville has to live with. And it's one of those things that kind of captures something that I really, really, really like to do, which is I like looking at pictures of old closed down amusement parks or abandoned malls, places where in my lifetime operated as a thing that was full of life and vibrancy and part of everyday life, that has now gone by the wayside, that has become obsolete, as Matthias would call Neville in this movie. And it's really, really interesting to see, Los Angeles completely desolate. And it does a really good job of Neville kind of struggling with that a little bit. While I don't necessarily fret or struggle over seeing pictures of an abandoned mall, I get this kind of, wow, I'm actually, this is something I can connect to a little bit more than, say, like the Greek ruins or something like that, because this was something in my lifetime that I could imagine myself being at when it was in full operation and so on and so forth. And it's now completely overrun by nature taking back over, and it's completely dead and lifeless now. Neville is desperate to try to hold on to old ideas, and it's kind of driven him insane a little bit. He goes to the movies, he watches the only movie that's available to him, which is Woodstock, which is interesting because it's actually there is two things that Woodstock does for him. One, it shows him a situation in which there are scores and hundreds of thousands of people all in one place living life again. There is a idealism to the people at Woodstock that he tries to desperately connect with and remember that humanity of. On the other hand, he also realizes that he is kind of going insane because he has nobody to talk to. He talks to himself. He talks to a bust of Julius Caesar and plays chess with him. But there are certain things that he is desperately trying to hang on to. Sunday dinners, he dresses for Sunday dinner, and he gets in this really nice frilly kind of dandy velvety smoking jacket. It's kind of fascinating and kind of awesome also. But he also tortures himself with this desolation. He keeps the window open so that when the family comes and tries to attack him each and every night, he sits there and listens to them call his name and try to provoke him and try to taunt him. And it's interesting. It's sad, but it's a really good way to encapsulate this kind of psychosis of this movie, of somebody desperately trying to hold on to something that will never be again, while the bad guy with Matthias, he is trying to he has a psychosis of his own, trying to create this new world, throw out everything that was and start anew. So you have these two kind of conflicting concepts. And with that said, number two, this movie is uniquely 70s. Everything from having a black woman like Rosalind Cash fall in love with a very staunch and, for a lack of a better word, I don't really want to get into anybody's politics or anything, but conservative. Charlton Heston as Neville in this movie is trying to conserve the way things used to be. So to have a almost quote unquote militant black woman fall in love with a staunch preserver of the way things were in Charlton Heston is a very early 70s concept. It's almost throwing a bone at to the idea of, look, we can all get along. We're just wearing, different color skin, whatever. It's that kind of concept. It seems a little funny today thinking about that, but at that point in time, it would have been deemed very progressive, but it's also extremely 70s. The way that Rosalind Cash talks is almost like it's ripped straight from, blaxploitation movies. The way that, as I mentioned, the way that Neville dresses for dinner on that Sunday is very 70s. The most 70s thing about this is the general concept of the youth is the future. That older people, and this kind of came up a little bit in Planet of the Apes a few years before this as well, but the youth is the future. They're going to learn from the mistakes of the past generations. However, the future, while it is kind of literally handed off to Dutch at the end of this movie with the serum, the problem is that the youth are seen as being too idealistic, with Richie trying to broker peace between the family and Neville, while also the old guard, which is Neville, absolutely positively refusing to be anything other than militant. And so it's this idea of the 70s that, hey, the future is these kids, but I ain't going to give them any of this fucking future myself. I'm going to continue on being nihilistic, being not thinking that there's any hope for the other side. And by the way, while Richie is talking to me about being obsolete myself and trying to convince me to broker peace, I'm going to load a gigantic machine gun and plan on going out hunting for the enemy. And then I'm going to ignore the kids, please, for peace. That's uniquely 70s too. It's the idea that the next generation will take over and they will lead us into the future, but right now they're stupid and we know best. It's a fascinating take on that, because there is no give in this movie. It's just implied that, yeah, the kids are going to be the future, but right now I'm not changing the way I do business with the enemy, basically. Thirdly, Charlton Heston. I mean, like I said, he's larger than life, and yes, absolutely, that comes across in this movie too. Charlton Heston made. I talked about that trio of movies that Roger Ebert pointed to and said any person who studies film will eventually see the Ten Commandments, Ben-Hur, and Planet of the Apes. For me, my introduction to Charlton Heston was Planet of the Apes, The Omega Man, and Soylent Green. 3 sci-fi movies that told of failures of man, basically, but also kind of dealing a little bit with the hubris of what takes over from that. So, but he's not like, yes, he's doing competent things that make that, yes, okay, he is an army doctor who knows how to do these things and save people from this plague. But let's face it, he's still Charlton Heston. He's one of those actors who transcends his parts, much like Jack Nicholson, who you see them in the movie and, oh, yeah, that's Charlton Heston, or, oh, that's Jack Nicholson, or, oh, that's Tom Cruise. They transcend the part that they're playing to the point where you just have to believe that Charlton Heston knows this stuff. And he does. He comes across likable, even though there is really no future for him either, and there's no real hope for him. You know, he is another victim of this plague and of that war that took place that the United States didn't really have any part in, which is, you know, but he shows through at least still a likability that you feel safe with him. When he shows up into a situation, you feel like he's going to win until he regains some of his humanity, and it kind of lets his guard down a little bit. So, fascinating role. The Omega Man is a pretty good movie, really. It's interesting to look at some of these concepts, things that we do worry about even to this day, and certainly over the last year or so when we've been dealing with a pandemic of our own. You know, thinking about how things like a plague or things like a you know, like the literal crumbling of civilization, and how things are going to change from that, and what we must entrust to be able to move forward and rebuild that civilization. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com, as well as places where you can find podcasts like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and Audible. Additionally, you can hop on over to Facebook and Twitter and follow us by searching for Film Seizure. And while you're at it, head on over to www.bmovieenema.com. That's my website where I do a review, a text review each and every Friday morning. You can also follow B Movie Enema on Facebook and Twitter by searching for just that. And while you're at it, you can head on over to YouTube and follow the B Movie Enema channel, where you can find clips of movies that I use in the articles, as well as episodes of B Movie Enema, the series, where I host a movie. Season 1 is over, but season 2 is starting in September, so you can get ready for that. But until next week, everybody, stay spooky.